So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Jamee Eggers is going to be visiting with us on Life After Proposition 12. Jamee Eggers is a highly regarded thought leader in animal agriculture. She has more than 20 years working in the livestock industry affairs, animal health, and well-being programs across a variety of species. Jamee is the Chief Operating Officer of Clover Animal Welfare Systems, which is a global company focusing on strategic animal welfare solutions for livestock and food producers. Jamee received her Bachelor's of Science degree from Iowa State University and her Master's of Science degree from the University of Nebraska. Both degrees were in the field of animal science. Jamee, together with her husband and son, are fourth and fifth generations on the family's corn, soy, pig farm in central Iowa. So with that, let's welcome Jamee to the podium.
Good morning. Good morning. I will echo what Steve Weiss said about this stage. I am a proud alum here at Iowa State. Never had a reason to stand up here on this particular stage, and it is intimidating as heck. This just the size of it. I know so many of you. It's also intimidating to give a presentation to people that you know well and your peers versus giving a presentation to strangers. So this will be fun, I hope, for all of us, and give you some information that you didn't have before about California Proposition 12 and the certification process. Somebody jokingly asked me when they saw the advertisement for Swine Day that this is the presentation that I'm giving, like, is there life after Prop 12? And I think that there is. It's different for everybody. And I am not really going to focus on the policy part or the policy discussions about Prop 12. I'm really going to focus on the certification process today. So a little bit about Cloverleaf Animal Welfare Systems, what gives me the authority to stand up here and talk to you about Prop 12. We're a global animal welfare company that started in 2017. We operate across South America, the EU, and the US. We produce a lot of our materials in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We do primarily animal welfare auditing, whether that's in person on the farm across all species or remote video auditing for meat plants particularly. We do have a certified care label, so similar to organic certifications or certified humane or any of the other label claim products. We have Cloverleaf certified care, which you can find in the stores at that image. We do a lot of training and education across all species, across various animal welfare topics. And then the most important thing is we were the first company to be accredited by the state of California as a Prop 12 certifying agent. And I'll talk more about that process in a minute. So like I said, I don't want to get into the policy discussion about Prop 12 and how Prop 12 or Q3, Massachusetts Q3 came into play. But I do put this slide up here to have a discussion about how Prop 12 is different and Q3 is different than some of these other statewide bans. If you do want to have a policy discussion, NPPC is here and happy to talk to you about the policy piece of it. But I also, for a long time, giving this presentation, I was including the background on California Proposition 12, and then I kind of got through the year last year and the beginning of this one and thought, everybody has heard this, everybody knows what Prop 12 is, I don't need to give the background on Prop 12, and then I gave this presentation last week without this stuff in it, and somebody said, what do you mean? So like every farm in the US has to be Prop 12 certified? And I thought, okay, not everybody knows the background. So you have these states that have statewide stall bans. So if you are raising sows in these states, you cannot put them in gestation stalls. You may be able to use G stalls for a small period of time and then mix them into group housing. They're a little bit variable in that, but California and Massachusetts are a little bit different in that, so not only in those states can you not put the sows in gestation stalls, but you also cannot sell the product from sows that have been raised in gestation stalls. So, and it applies to everything outside of California or Massachusetts. The real basics on California Proposition 12 are that it's administered by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So you'll hear me say CDFA. and that's what I'm referring to. It's specifically their animal care program within CDFA that administers it. And you have to understand that it is the animals and the covered products. So for laying hens, it's the housing for the laying hens and affects the sale of their shell or liquid eggs. For veal calves, it's the housing that those veal calves are raised in that affects the veal meat that's sold. And then for sows, or for pigs, it's the breeding pigs, the sows, and gilts, and the whole pork meat that is sold from those animals. So you'll hear me say compliant animal or covered animal, that's referring to the sows. And then you'll hear me say covered product, and that's the egg or meat product as associated with it. And then because California Department of Food and Agriculture doesn't have the capacity to inspect and certify all of the facilities that are required in that process, they accredit third-party groups like Cloverleaf Animal Welfare Systems or any of the other auditing companies that you may know of to verify compliance with the regulations. And the majority of my presentation is going to be about what that compliance looks like, and like what does the actual on-farm audit look like. This part, a warning, will get pretty boring for you because the devil is literally in the details of the definitions that are provided as a part of Prop 12. So we're going to walk through the really important ones for you. There are really only two entities in the regulatory framework that have to be inspected and certified. So the sow farm, and then the distributor who is selling the product to the end user. Everybody else in between has to be a part of the audit trail. So the audit trail are all of the documents that are providing sufficient detail to show that the pork chop in the store went through a certified and inspected distributor, and that can be traced all the way back to a certified sow farm. So there's really only the two inspected groups, but everybody else participates as being a part of the audit trail. Then when it comes to the actual animals, when we're talking about sows, you're, the like very baseline, absolute minimum requirement is covered under usable floor space and a compliant enclosure. So the sows, the breeding pigs, have to have 24 square feet and be able to turn around freely without touching the side of the enclosure or another animal. And we'll get into a lot of examples about that in the certification process. But usable floor space and compliant enclosure are like the absolute, you have to know what those are, 24 square feet, and be able to turn around freely without touching the side of the enclosure or another animal. And then provisions for split operations. So this is a farm or a distributor that has covered animals and not covered animals. So this is a sow farm that has that is raising Prop 12 sows in pens, and also not Prop 12 sows in gestation stalls or some other iteration, less square feet or whatever. Same for distributors. So they may be distributing whole pork meat that is Prop 12 compliant at the same time that they're also selling or distributing whole pork meat that is not compliant with Prop 12. So there are provisions. It's not an all or nothing. There are provisions to be technically both. And then these are the two that are really, really important for sows. So the regulations define breeding pigs as a female pig who is 6 months of age or older or pregnant. And so we're talking about gilts and sows on the sow farm. Boars don't matter. Boars are not a part of Prop 12 inspection. Then the really confusing and important part is the production cycle, which is the life cycle of a breeding pig. So for gilts, that starts at 6 months of age, which the majority of our commercial gilts are going to be older than 6 months of age. And the key point underlined, and are moved into an enclosure for breeding. And then that production cycle ends when that litter of piglets is weaned. So, and then for sows, the new production cycle begins when each litter of piglets is weaned. So the best way to think about this is when you breed or lock sows or gilts up to breed them is when their production cycle starts, And that production cycle, they have to be in compliant enclosure, the 24 square feet and turn around freely, for the duration of their production cycle, which ends when they wean the piglets, with the exception of farrowing. So they can be in a non-compliant enclosure from the 5 days before farrowing to their weaning time, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But production cycle and the "and" of production cycle are really important definitions. There are exemptions written into the regs, so animals that are being raised for medical research don't have to be held to the 24 square feet. If for examination, testing, individual treatment, or operation for veterinary purposes, and we'll go into a lot of detail about that. During transportation, rodeo, state fair, county fair exhibitions, any type of exhibition, while they're at the exhibition, they don't have to be held to that 24 square feet. And then during slaughter, so like lairage in slaughter, as long as they're being harvested according to California's code. And then the last two are the ones I'm really going to spend a lot of time camped on, which is the 5 days before farrowing, their expected farrowing date, and then during temporary periods of animal husbandry, and I'll give you tons of details about those. So the four very, very important exemptions for pork producers are the temporary holding for animal husbandry purposes. So this is like putting them in individual housing for breeding, for heat checking, for pregnancy confirmation, any of those like routine husbandry practices. They can be placed in non-compliant housing for no more than 6 hours in a 24-hour period, and no more than 24 hours total in a 30-day period. Then you also have the exemption, they can't be moved into farrowing until no more than 5 days before their expected farrowing date. And then if you need to treat a sow individually, so let's say she is fighting, or she's really lame, or you need to increase her body condition score and feed her individually, you can put them in non-compliant housing to do those things under a veterinary exemption. So you have to have SOPs or policies and procedures that talk about what that treatment plan is. You have to record that information on an individual sow basis, and it has to be done with a current and valid veterinary client-patient relationship. All right, there are several steps to certification. This will slightly oversimplify it, but I can also tell you that technically speaking, the certification process is not all that complex. The first is that you hire a certifying agent. So if you go onto CDFA's website, they will list, I think right now there's about 16 of them on there. So you reach out to the certifying agent that you wish to use for your on-site inspection and certification, go through their process. They will have an application contract and gather some information to prepare for your audit. You have to be a little bit mindful of sorting through that certifying agent list, because not all of them do pigs, or not all of them do, some of them only do distributors, or some of them only do veal calves, for example. So Cloverleaf, a little plug for us, we have a ton of industry experience, and we do all the species and distributors, but we are a little bit the oddball. Not everybody does that on the certifying list. Now, you can use CDFA, and so CDFA does have a limited amount of inspectors that they will send to the farm or the distributor to do inspection, and they do it for free, but they have so much less limited availability to do so that typically if you call and ask CDFA to do it, they will say, we can't get to you for at least 190 days, so you probably need to check out the list of certifying agents. So it is possible, you can use them, it's free, but you're probably going to have struggled to get them out to the farm sooner rather than later. For distributors, they also have a separate step in that they are required to register with CDFA as a distributor. So they register and they have an on-site inspection for certification. So then you prepare for your on-site inspection. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but that's like preparing your records that will be reviewed, scheduling your inspection. So every on-site inspection is scheduled. There are no surprise audits for Prop 12. If someone shows up at your farm and says that they're here to do your Prop 12 certification and you don't know anything about it or know them, then that is somebody acting nefariously. That's not, they're all planned and scheduled. So then I will give you a ton of details about what the actual on-site inspection looks like. If you have any corrective actions, so if there's anything that's lacking or non-conforming in your audit report from your inspection, you get an opportunity to correct those. And then once you do that, you receive certification, and then you get a certificate. And this certificate, think about it like as the farm or the pig's license. This certificate for that sow farm literally has to travel with the pigs to harvest or to the distributor, the packer and then distributor, as its license that it is Prop 12 certified. And that certificate follows the offspring of those breeding pigs through and participates in the audit trail. So ultimately, in the audit trail, everything has to be traced back to a certificate from the farm. And then to stay current, you have to do this entire process. So hire your certifying agent, do your on-farm inspection every year or every 12 months. You have to do it prior to the expiration that is on your certificate. And so you do that every year to stay current and certified. All right, there are two primary parts of the certification audit. So when I come to your farm to certify it for Prop 12, there are two pretty major activities that I will do on the farm. The first is measuring the animal confinement space and making sure that all of the covered animals have 24 square feet and can turn around freely. And then documentation for any of the times that they're not in compliant housing. And then there's pretty extensive record keeping. As you can see with this picture up here with Dr. Chris Sievers, the sows like to help us measure their enclosures a lot of the time. But I'll give you a ton of details about this particular process. So when we go out to verify the 24 square feet in the enclosures, we literally measure the length and the width of the enclosure on the inside of the fence, because that's the usable space of the pigs, and multiply it and then divide it by the number of animals that we count in the pen to determine that they have 24 square feet. And then we also note, can they turn around freely in that enclosure? And if you're at all familiar with any other type of like animal welfare auditing on the farm, which uses just a sample size, a sample population of the farm, Prop 12 certification is for every covered animal. Every enclosure that is housing a covered animal on the farm is subject to this verification that they are. So we measure the pen, count the pigs, verify that they have 24 square feet and can turn around freely. It's not just a sample of the farm. So a little bit more discussion about turning around freely. It is literally, can they turn in a full circle without impediment? So that includes a tether, but without touching the side of the enclosure or another animal. So 3-point turns don't count. So picture the Austin Powers movie when he gets the golf cart stuck in the hallway and he has to do the 86 times to get it out. That does not count as turning around freely. So here would be an example of an enclosure where they cannot do that, okay? So they can back out of their stalls, but the alleyway is not wide enough for them to turn around freely without having to touch the side of an enclosure. There are setups like this, though, so if you have that alleyway that is narrow and the sow can back out into an open area where she can turn around freely, as long as they have 24 square feet of usable floor space in that enclosure, this would be acceptable. Here's just another example where they don't have another alleyway behind them, where they have room to turn around freely once they back out of the stall. Another couple examples, so here would be like a small group of shoulder stanchion feeders where they've got plenty of room behind them to turn around freely, or they can move into the other open area to do so. So by definition, in the regulations, Prop 12 is not a group housing law, but the practical application is to put the sows into group housing, right? That's the most functional way to operate a commercial sow farm. But what that means is that as long as the sows have 24 square feet of usable floor space in their enclosure during their production cycle, any of these housing types are an option. So we see lots of combinations of ESF and free access stalls. You can do small pen drop feeding. Like, any of these are technically an option as long as you meet the 24 square feet and turn around freely. We get a lot of questions about, so like, what about a free access stall where the sows can technically lock themselves into the stall? They can choose to go lay in the free access stall. What does that mean for, and as long as they can freely and willingly go in and out of that free access stall, and the total usable floor space, including the spot that they would go in the free access stall, allows them to have 24 square feet, then that is an acceptable enclosure for Prop 12. We do get a lot of questions about the actual usable floor space. So as long as they don't have to step up or jump up or walk up a ladder into a space, you can count feeders, waterers, the large electronic sow feeders. I'll show you an example. You can count all of that as usable floor space. If the animal can easily and willingly lay on it if they choose to, then it can be included in the usable floor space. But something like this example where you have like the brain, the computer guts part of the electronic sow feeding system where they can't lay on the computer pieces, but they can lay or go into the electronic sow feeding chute, then you would only have to remove the space taken up by the brain of the ESF that they can't lay on from their usable floor space, or usable, the 24 square feet. One of the best things that farms can do in preparing for their audit is to literally sketch out a map of their farm and then draw the size of the enclosures and the maximum number of animals that they would put in each of those enclosures. That helps give the auditor a really good idea of what they're verifying. A little note to the building companies, you guys have blueprints that are center of gate to center of gate, and usable floor space is calculated on the inside of the fence. Usually that's not going to make a difference, right, in total square footage available to the sows, but in some situations it does. So don't simply rely on the blueprints from your farm. You got to make sure that the measurements that are shown on the barn map are the actual interior of the enclosure and not center of gate to center of gate. Okay, so you go through your, or the second piece of your on-farm certification is the record-keeping piece. Lots and lots of details and records that are required. You have to maintain them for a minimum, no less than 2 years. And then you have to, they're not clearly defined on exactly what it has to be, but you have to provide sufficient detail that those animals were covered in compliance. So if you're locking sows up to heat check or breed, or whatever you need to do, and you're utilizing that 6 hours in a 24-hour period and no more than 24 in a 30-hour period, you have to have documentation to show when they are locked up and when they are not. You have to have documentation. So if you're using the veterinary exemption, you have to have your evidence of your VCPR, and you have to show the policies or the procedures, the treatment plan for those individual animals, and then that your documentation to show that you're not putting sows into farrowing more than 5 days before their expected farrowing date, and that if they're going to be, their next production cycle will be Prop 12 compliant, it needs to be, they have to go back into their compliant enclosure within 6 hours of weaning. If you are running a split operation, then you need to demonstrate your segregation procedures. So how are the weaned pigs that are Prop 12 compliant being separated or segregated from the weaned pigs that are not Prop 12 compliant on the farm? And then lots of records that I like to say are the business of raising pigs. So purchase records, gilt, when you move gilts into the farm, sales records, placement records, kind of, again, they're just these general records of the inventory of the farm and the business of raising pigs. Those records they can be paper, they can be electronic, they can be a combination of any of them. The regulations don't stipulate exactly what those records have to be or how they have to be kept. They, for the most part, can be by group ID. Not everything on the farm has to be individually ID'd, so you can use group IDs in your records, unless, the only exception would be for the individual veterinary treatment exemption. So those records need to be, the treatment records for those sows need to be on an individual sow basis. The best advice I can give you is be consistent about it, but you can use a combination of electronic and paper records. So some of the most common things that we see that are not conformances or something that's wrong with Prop 12 inspections are that, so we see farms that are holding gilts and sows at different densities. So we all know that usually a gilt is smaller than a P3 sow, right? And so physically they are taking up less space than a sow would be. But you have to recall the definition of production cycle, breeding pig and production cycle. So it's Prop 12 and the 24 square feet applies to everything that's 6 months of age and older and locked up to be bred or is bred. So it doesn't matter if gilts are smaller, they still have to have 24 square feet, and that's not based on their size, it's based on the size of the enclosure that they're in. We have seen farms that try to leave animals in non-compliant treatment enclosures until farrowing, so that is against the intent of the law. And again, I don't want to get into a policy discussion about the but I'm treating her until farrowing. There's documentation requirements there, but we have also seen farms that they either put the sows into farrowing for their entire gestation period to get around the rule, which is not the intent at all. There's tons of confusion about other countries or other program regulations and certification programs. So the easiest way to understand this is there are absolutely zero equivalencies to Prop 12. So even the EU standards or Canada's good production practices that allow for a certain percentage of the sows to be in gestation stalls when the other percentage has to be in open pen gestation. The EU has pretty strict regulations on gestation stalls. None of those are equivalent. Or if you're participating in American Humane Certified or any of those other organic programs or any other label claims, none of those are equivalent. So even if you are from another country where you feel like your country's regulations exceed Prop 12, you still have to be Prop 12 certified. Absolutely zero equivalencies. And then the most common thing is to see a lack of complete documentation. So, documenting at an individual, at a group level when those sows are being locked up for breeding or heat checking or pregnancy confirmation, then documenting at an individual sow level what kind of veterinary treatment is happening under the veterinary exemption. And then it's really uncommon for us at a group level on a commercial sow farm to note the date that we're moving them into farrowing. So that's probably the one that's missed the most. I'm going to take my auditor hat off for a minute and put my consulting hat on and talk a little bit about what does literally, figuratively life after Prop 12 look like for the sows, and what are producers doing to manage sows or changing to manage sows, or challenges in managing these sows in Prop 12 housing. I would say the biggest complaint or the biggest challenge is utilizing your space well. What do you do with returns? What do you do with opens? All that stuff is just really challenging, and you have less flexibility to manage that. So each farm is really trying to figure out how to best manage those situations when you have sows or a sow that can't really move with their group to utilize the space like before. Obviously, we know this even before Prop 12 when we started really exploring group housing is what's the best time to mix sows, and how do we mix sows post-weaning to minimize aggression and fighting. So that's a challenge in open pen gestation farms regardless if they're Prop 12 or not. But I think the two things that I see happening the most are really focusing on making sure that sows are full. They have full bellies when they get mixed, and there's plenty of feed available to them in the space when they are mixing. And then if you can, decrease the filling time of those really large pens to decrease the fighting time that you might experience. Managing gilts is I have heard a mixed bag. So I've heard a lot of gilt development folks tell me that they thought that breeding gilts in pens was going to be a nightmare. And then they're actually like, actually, it's not as bad as we thought. They're kind of managing it and working it out. And then they have said that they have actually noticed that their conception rates have gone up, which surprised them. So they're like, I'm not going to tell you that 24 square feet is the answer for gilts, but I'm going to tell you that it's definitely more than the typical 18 that we run gilts at to maximize our space. So maybe there's a silver lining in there. And then you really, 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 because of the lameness issue, have to focus on gilt structure selection or conformation selection. And then the lameness and increased death loss are very real, and it's a part of it with Prop 12 production. So farms that are spending a lot of time figuring out how to balance, a lameness from injury versus an infectious cause, and how do you treat those differently? What do you do with them in individual treatment? And then how do you manage your facilities? So what feels like simple things like making sure the floors are dry when you're mixing sows, so that if they do start fighting, they have less opportunity to slip and to be lame from an injury like that. I can save these for the Q&A section if you'd like, but these are the most commonly asked questions that I get, so I'll just take that Q&A opportunity away from you. Is there a time limit for how long an animal can be not in 24 square feet during individual treatment and veterinary exemption? The short answer to that is no. It's not written into the regulations that she can only be in receiving individual treatment for lameness for 30 days or whatever. There's nothing specific written into the regulations. There are several kind of traps that CDFA asks us as certifying agents to run it through, like is the sow being rechecked, or are we just putting in the sow in the stall, forgetting about her for 90 days and then whatever? Is there a period of rechecking to see that she can return to compliant housing? Does she have a space to return to compliant housing? So you can't use the veterinary exemption to put nearly everything in stalls and then backfill that pen with Prop 12 sows, right? Like, she has to be able to return, have an opportunity somewhere or a space to return to treatment. That the treatment records are under an individual and on an individual animal basis, those types of things. So what documentation will be required for farms to show that the breeding sows have not been restricted more than 6 hours in the 24 hours and no more than 24 in the 30-day period? The regulations are not specific about that. It is whatever record-keeping system works best for the farm. Most of the time what we see is some documentation of, we locked this group up at this time and we released them at this time. But it can be whatever system works for the farm. So are packers audited, or is it only producers? The answer is kind of, sometimes. So if you'll remember from that regulatory framework, you have the farm that's audited, and then you have the distributor. And packers participate in the audit trail by requiring or providing some of the information in between the distributor and the farm. Sometimes packers are distributors, so they go through a distributor inspection. It just depends on what kind of activities that packer is doing. But they do, they are selling to a distributor, and that distributor is required to participate in the audit trail. They have to do 3 product code tracebacks as part of their distributor audit. So they will go to their supplier, the packer, and ask for the documentation as part of the audit trail. So how does a packer or processor know if a producer has passed an audit? And that's all based on the certificate. That certificate is the license. That is what is provided to the packer to know that that farm has passed an audit. And then is packers required to verify or check any documentation prior to animals being unloaded at the facility? That is 100%, the answer to that question is 100% based on whatever the packer's policies and procedures are for that. So some packers are segregating certain days for harvesting Prop 12 pigs. Some of them only assign, they might harvest Prop 12 pigs every day, but they only assign certain dock times to Prop 12 pigs. A good majority of them are giving a different tattoo code to Prop 12 pigs versus non-Prop 12 pigs, but it's all completely dependent on the packer's SOP and their procedures for harvesting Prop 12 product. The Cloverleaf has a bunch of resources that are available, so a lot of those pictures that I showed you about compliant enclosures and everything you can find at that QR code if you're interested. And then CDFA also has a lot of information. They have guidance documents on what to expect in an on-farm inspection. They have a couple of videos on there. They have a sow housing guide that goes over usable floor space and how to calculate that and all of those things. And then this is where you can find us at Cloverleaf or me, and I am happy to answer any questions that I missed.
We can raise the lights for a little bit to allow the audience to ask any questions. Thank you, Jamie, for your time and your insight. That's actually good information. I was learning a little bit as we went along on some different definitions of how a sow can turn around. We certainly have about 5 minutes or so before the next speaker, so let's go ahead. The mics are on the ends there. You're welcome to reach out to a mic, or if you're down low and you want to holler up to Jamie, feel free to do so.
Pat McGonigal said he had questions.
Just repeat the question if you could, Jamie.
I will.
Okay.
So if I have an animal that was exempt for treatment and I don't have, do I have to have a pen space for her, or once she's been isolated, can she stay there as long as she needs that to recover?
Oh, I think you're asking me the question. So you asked if I have a sow that I put into individual housing for treatment, does she have to have a pen to go to? And can she stay in that pen? So are you asking if it one for one, like do I have to have a treatment pen for every sow available, or?
She continues to need to be in the pen. Can she stay there the rest of the, or in the confinement for the rest of the time?
Yeah, so she needs to be in that pen to be treated individually. Can she stay there the rest of her production cycle? So the answer to that question would be it depends. So it's not defined by the regulations how long or not she can be in individual housing for veterinary treatment, but we do have the traps we got to run it through, which is, could she go back to compliant housing if her treatment was complete? Does she have, so is there a space available for her if she was? Is there some kind of follow-up? Like, so I don't know, does the SOP say, for example, that every 10 days we go check her condition and we document that? Or is the SOP say we treat her for 4 days with this and then we switch the next 4 days with this? Like, are there policies, procedures, documentation to show that we just didn't put her in there and forget about her until we have to move her to farrowing? So can she go back? Is she receiving individual treatment records? Can I review those and say, yep, she was looked at 3 days ago, then she was treated with this, and then whatever. It kind of depends. Yes, you could leave her in there her entire gestation period and still be considered a compliant sow, as long as all of those other pieces are a part of it. And that would be really dependent on the audit and the auditor and the record keeping and the, the individual farm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, good question about the estimate of Prop 12 pigs relative to demand. I can tell you that I think it's kind of evening itself out. I think this is probably a better question for NPPC, but So if you look at the top 40 pork powerhouses, you'll see that just about everybody in the top 40 has some level of production in Prop 12. Not all of it, but some level of it. And you don't necessarily hear about packers out in the market actively recruiting or actively encouraging remodeling or building or with premiums for Prop 12 products. So I think what we have right now is currently meeting the demand. The flip side of that is you have decreased demand in California.
Two questions. How has the California Department of Agriculture been to work with, and do you see them being kind of evolutionary and fluid? That's the first question. The second question is, do you see, and I'm asking you to look into the future, that animal activists will be pressuring California Department of Agriculture to change the rules as we move forward?
So the first question was, how has California Department of Food and Agriculture been to work with? I would tell you pretty good. They're under the typical regulatory constraints and pressures of a state agency, right? So they have limitations on what kind of advice they can give us as certifying agents. They have limitations on how they can aggregate the questions that we ask and share them with other certifying agents. But I would tell you that they're very responsive to our questions as a certifying agent. They've been adaptable and willing to talk through literally every scenario we have presented them on. They're like, how do you think we should do with this? They do host a call every month for all certifying agents where we can sort of calibrate and talk about these scenarios so that we're all sharing the same information. So I would tell you they're doing the best they can, and they're in terms of a regulatory agency, they're pretty supportive and responsive to their certifying agents. The second question about activists pressuring CDFA, absolutely. I think that's the next step. My personal belief, this is not the position of Cloverleaf, it's not the position of anybody else, it's my personal belief, is that activists are watching and waiting how this first year and a half of certifications is going, and then they'll use Freedom of Information Act, FOIA requests to get more information and put pressure on the system and that kind of thing. And I think it's important, you bring up a good point that I should share. As a certifying agent, the only thing that I am required to share with CDFA is the list of certified sites, the list of certified farms that we audited, the list of certified distributors. I don't turn every audit report over to CDFA. They don't have any of the documentation that's a copy of the documentation that's required to get your certification. I don't even turn applications for services over. It's literally by January 15th, I have to turn on this list of certified sites. That's it. Now, it's subject to CDFA auditing me, and so they could review audit reports and applications for services and things like that, but that's not automatically turned over to CDFA. It's literally just the list.
Very good.
Hey, I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say lameness and increased death loss are very real in Prop 12 compliant barns?
Yeah, they are. Just about every large commercial sow farm that is in Prop 12 housing is that they will note increased death loss and increased lameness in their sows. Dr. Kara Hayden from Pipestone has provided a lot of really good field study data from Pipestone system about the increase in treatments, the increase in lameness, increase in death loss, and yeah, it's real. It's part of it.
Perfect. Great discussion, and certainly we want to continue that, but we're going to move on. And so if you have any more questions, Jamie will be around for lunch. And so you can certainly catch up with her and ask some additional questions. So again, let's thank Jamie for her time today. Thank you.